Hello everyone, welcome to Achievers IS classes. Let's begin our analysis on the monthly roundup where we look into some of the most important issues of the month gone by. So let's begin with the first issue, which is on Jallikattu. Jallikattu is a bull taming sport which is conducted in Tamil Nadu during the Sankranthi festival, and it is in news because of the death of some of the participants and injury to many others. The sport has drawn the attention of animal rights activists for the innumerable accounts of cruelty to bulls, but there have been human casualties also, even when necessary precautions are taken, mainly because one cannot prepare for the behavior of a rampaging bull. The organizers of the event undertook various precautions, like the setting up of a makeshift operation theater having barricades, but unpredictability is intrinsic to the sport, and the attempt to ban the sport has been opposed on the ground that it is inseparable from Tamil Nadu's culture, therefore prompting the Tamil Nadu government to pass an ordinance to allow the holding of Jallikattu. Despite a ban by the Supreme Court, the central government had exempted bulls from the rules frame for the conduct of the event, but the loss of human lives might lead to the regulations getting tighter in the coming years. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the Devadasi custom, which is still prevalent in certain parts of Karnataka even after the state passed the Karnataka Devadasis Prohibition of Dedication Act of 1982 more than 36 years ago. Even though the state government passed the legislation, the rules are yet to be notified under the law, and the practice of dedicating young girls to temples as an offering to appease the gods has been prevalent not just in Karnataka but has also spread to neighboring Goa. This has been found out by the two new studies conducted by the National Law School of India University and the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The study highlights the apathetic approach of the legislature and the enforcement agencies to crack down on the practice, which is particularly prevalent among the oppressed communities of North Karnataka. One of the most disturbing aspects revealed by the new studies is that children with physical or mental disabilities are more vulnerable to be dedicated as Devdasis, as nearly 1 in 5 of those dedicated as Devdasis were found to be children with disabilities. Further, the study found that girls from the socio-economically marginalized communities continued to be the victims of such a custom and thereafter were forced into the commercial sex racket. The reporting of the cases pertaining to the custom was also very low, and the practice continues to receive customary sanction from families and the communities involved. Also, the law focuses on the prosecution of the victims themselves with no framework for the rehabilitation, and despite sufficient evidence for the prevalence of the practice and its link to the sexual exploitation, legislations like the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act and the Juvenile Justice Act have not made any reference to such a practice, which is seen as a form of sexual exploitation of children. Further, even the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Law or the proposed Trafficking of Persons Prevention, Protection and Rehabilitation Bill of 2018 does not recognize these dedicated girls as victims of trafficking for sexual purposes. Finally, the studies highlight the state's failure to enhance the livelihood sources for the weaker sections, which is identified as one of the contributory factors for the continuation of this practice, thereby demanding a more inclusive socio-economic development along with a legislative overhaul and a more proactive role from the state agencies to tackle the menace. The next issue in news is regarding the Citizenship Amendment Bill. The bill seeks to amend the Citizenship Act of 1955 and thereby grant Indian citizenship to six persecuted minorities, namely the Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, Parsis, Christians, and Buddhists from the neighboring countries of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh who came to our country prior to the year 2014. This is seen as a violation of the Assam Accord of 1985, which had set March 1971 as the cutoff date for the migrants entering the state, and many protests were launched opposing the recent Citizenship Amendment Bill. In this regard, the Centre has set up a high-level committee headed by former IAS officer Mr. MP Base Barua in order to assess the appropriate level of reservation of seats in the Assam Assembly and the local bodies for the Assamese people along with reservation with respect to employment opportunities. This is in line with the clause 6 of the Assam Accord, which states that constitutional, legislative and administrative safeguards shall be provided to protect, preserve and promote the cultural, social, linguistic identity and heritage of the Assamese people. The next issue in news is regarding the annual status of education report, which is brought out by NGO Pratham. The survey highlights the learning outcomes in children across different classes using various yardsticks based on their arithmetic and reading abilities. The findings highlight the shortcomings in the reading and arithmetic abilities in rural schools as there is no dramatic improvement in the learning outcomes over the previous years. The survey, which included 596 rural districts, found out that some states like Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, Kerala and Haryana did better on the arithmetic. Other states like Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and even Karnataka scored low, and a significant percentage of the students were not even able to recognize the letters, thereby highlighting a severe barrier to learning. In this regard, the center should institute a review mechanism involving all the states for both the government and private institutions which offer elementary and middle school education, and a consultation on the activity based learning outcomes and various innovations which have been employed in the better performing states can be employed in order to improve the learning outcomes. The enactment of the Right to Education Act has indeed helped the enrollment rate, which has reached at 96% as per the SR data, but at present children start learning in a variety of environments ranging from poorly equipped Anganwadi centers to private nurseries. Therefore, the solution to the problem lies in multiple approaches and employing innovative methods which have been successful elsewhere. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the 124th Constitutional Amendment Bill, which was recently passed in the Lok Sabha, thereby allowing 10% quota in employment and education for the general category candidates who belong to the economically weaker sections. It has to stand the judicial scrutiny, which had laid down a 50% limit on total reservation, which could only be breached in extraordinary situations. In the famous Indra Sawhney case, the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court had struck down a provision which earmarked 10% reservation for the economically backward, citing that economic criteria cannot be the sole basis to determine the backwardness of a community. Therefore, any attempt to amend the constitution to extend what is limited to the socially and educationally backward to those who are economically weak is problematic because given the creamy layer limit above which the OBC candidates become ineligible for reservations, the recent amendment creates an uneasy parity between the socially and educationally backward classes with limited means of livelihood and those who are socially and educationally advanced but economically weak. Further, the Supreme Court in the Nagaraj case of 2006 has ruled that equality is part of the basic structure of the Constitution and said that the 50% reservation ceiling limit was one of the constitutional requirements without which the structure of equality of opportunity would collapse. Another issue to be looked at is whether reservations can be given to a section that is already adequately represented in public employment, but it is not clear if the government has quantifiable data to show whether the people from this community, that is the economically weaker sections, are underrepresented in government service. Given all this, it has to be remembered that reservations have been traditionally provided to undo the historical injustice, and the question is whether these benefits should be extended to those with social and educational capital but with limited means. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the appointment of a Lokpal. The Supreme Court has set a deadline for the 8-member search committee to recommend a panel of names before the end of February. This shortlisted candidates has to be sent to the selection committee headed by the Prime Minister for the appointment of a Lokpal, which has been pending for 5 years since the Lokpal Act was passed in 2013. The search committee was only formed in September 2018 after a petition filed by an NGO Common Cause against the government over its delay in constituting the Lokpal despite a Supreme Court verdict in April 2017. What is to be considered here is the search committee requires some groundwork as its composition has to be drawn from diverse fields such as anti-corruption, public administration, law, banking and insurance, and also half its membership should consist of women, backward classes, minority and SC/ST candidates. Also, the search committee has been handicapped because of the lack of office space, manpower, infrastructure and a secretariat which are needed for its effective functioning. Further, there is also some degree of politics involved because the selection committee includes the Lok Sabha Speaker, the leader of the opposition, and the Chief Justice of India, along with an eminent jurist. But the leader of the opposition has been skipping the meetings because he is considered as a special invitee and not as a full-time member. This is because the government sticks to its view that he has not been recognized as the leader of the opposition by the speaker, but this is a minor issue which has been resolved with respect to appointments to other posts such as the CBI director and the Central Vigilance Commissioner by a simple amendment to treat the leader of the largest opposition party as the leader of the opposition for his membership in the selection committee. All these issues reflect the lack of political will to establish the Lokpal, and after long delays, a Supreme Court push was needed to establish the authority. The next issue is regarding the recent tragedy of 15 workers getting trapped in a rat hole coal mine in Meghalaya. Most of these coal mines are illegal, and this is not the first time such incidents have occurred, thereby questioning the government's inaction. The primary responsibility for the operation of these illegal mines lies with the state government, and it should be made accountable for ignoring the directions of the National Green Tribunal, which had ordered to close these illegal mines as well as levy punitive royalties on those extracting coal. In spite of this, illegal mining has continued, thereby endangering the life of the workers in the coal mines. The primary reason why these people prefer to work in these coal mines are poverty and the lack of other revenues in the vicinity, as well as the higher than average wages paid for the extraction of coal in these mines. In this regard, the state government has done little to implement any reforms and diversify the employment away from the dirty mining activity, but it should not forget that it is the responsibility of both the center and the state government to rehabilitate the workers from these impoverished communities, which also include some child laborers who have been employed in this risky industry. Although the scale of this rehabilitation is high, it should not be difficult considering the value of already extracted coal stored in Meghalaya and the fact that these mineral resources should be treated as state property for adequate actions. In this regard, a cleanup is long overdue and a review of these illegal mining activities has to be done in order to counter the menace. The next issue is regarding the recent breakout of the H1N1 influenza virus. The seasonal outbreak of such influenza virus poses a significant public health challenge with the number of recorded cases by the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program reaching around 42,000 over the past 6 years. The spike in infections during the first 2 weeks of the current year also calls for an effective plan to contain it, with Rajasthan being the worst affected state so far. Now that we have better understanding of the nature of the virus and the availability of suitable vaccine, state governments have no excuse for failing to reduce the spread of the virus and also ask what preventive measures were put in place based on their previous experience. Large scale vaccination covering high risk groups such as health workers, people with respiratory disorders, diabetics, and elderly could reduce the impact of viruses in several states such as Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Gujarat, etc., all of which reported high number of cases in the previous years. Therefore, a universal preventive program should be considered, and also the Union Health Ministry should put out an advisory on the right vaccine, as most public health programs are not prepared for a mass adoption of the vaccine. Also, the issue of non-availability of sufficient doses of the vaccine as well as profiteering due to high demand have not been addressed so far. Therefore, it should be made part of the public health system through schemes such as the Ayushman Bharat, which can easily provide vaccine to everyone using the public and private institutions. Further, campaigns to educate the public through mass media, especially on the respiratory etiquette and risk reduction, can help cut transmission of the virus and at the same time upgrading the existing vaccines by enabling better communication and information access to researchers through open access databases can provide genetic insights and help in tracking down the mutations of the virus. Lastly, the availability of antiviral drugs such as the oseltamivir should be ensured, all of which requires a concerted public health push to tackle the periodic outbreaks of such influenza virus. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding a series of measures which were announced by the GST Council to ease the tax and compliance burden for small businesses. In the recent GST Council meeting, the exemption limit for GST compliance has been raised from the previous rupees 20 lakhs to rupees 40 lakhs of annual turnover. Also, the annual turnover limit for eligibility for the composition scheme has been raised to 1.5 crore rupees, thereby making the eligible companies to file annual returns and pay taxes quarterly. These moves are said to benefit the small businesses, which is highlighted by the Confederation of All India Traders, which has said that the increase in limit would allow about 10 lakh traders to be exempt from the GST compliance burden, and the increasing of the composition scheme limit would further benefit about 20 lakh small businesses. The finance minister also announced that the limit for the eligibility for the composition scheme would also be applicable to small service providers with an annual turnover of up to rupees 50 lakhs. Apart from these measures, the GST Council also decided to allow Kerala to levy a cess of up to 1% on the intrastate supplies to help finance the disaster relief efforts following the recent floods in the state. And on the issue of taxing real estate and lotteries, the GST Council has decided to set up a separate group of ministers to look into the issue and present their assessment to the council. Now let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the relationship between inflation rates and the policy rates determined by the RBI. The inflation in consumer price index stood at 2.19% in December, which is at an 18-month low, while the wholesale price index stood at 3.8%, which is at an 8-month low. This is way below the projections of the RBI, which has maintained that the CPI projection would be in the range of 4.4 to 4.8% for the second half of the fiscal year 2019. In this regard, the Monetary Policy Committee and the RBI may well want to reassess the robustness of their inflation projection mechanism in the light of this new data. There may be also pressure on the RBI for a rate cut due to various factors like the fall in the factory output growth, the slowdown in certain sectors like automobiles, where sales have been falling over the last 2 months, but there are diverging trends with respect to inflation, like core inflation, which excludes volatile items like food and fuel, still stands at close to 6%, and also there is a divergence between core rural and urban inflation. This divergence and volatility in different subgroups are a major challenge in inflation assessment and projection. However, the RBI must also look into whether the interest rate structure is lagging behind the big structural change in inflation in the last few years. Therefore, a relook at the interest rate structure is demanded for, and it remains to be seen how the RBI responds to these demands. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding beating plastic pollution. As you are aware, the theme of the World Environment Day of 2018 was to beat plastic pollution, and India was praised for its resolve to eliminate single use plastic by the year 2022. So far, around 22 states and union territories have joined the fight and have announced a ban on the single use plastics such as carry bags, cups, plates, thermocol products, and many more states are expected to follow. Following the ban, some cities have reported positive results like the Bengaluru Waste Collective, which found that the volume of plastic waste has dropped from the previously 2 tons a day to less than 100 kgs now. However, this is only a small start because waste plastic from packaging of everything from food, cosmetics, and groceries delivered by several online platforms remains unaddressed. Further, the plastic waste management rules were clear that the producers, importers, and brand owners must adopt a collect back system for the plastic they introduced into the environment. But not much has been done to take the process forward, and there is an anomalous situation where the small producers of plastic are facing the ban, while the more organized entities, which are covered by the extended producer responsibility clause, continue with business as usual. Therefore, going forward, cities and towns need competent municipal systems which play a major role, and the government should also look into the fast moving consumer goods sector which uses large volumes of plastic for packaging with the same urgency of eliminating the single use plastics. The next issue is regarding the risks associated with germline editing. The recent experiment by a Chinese scientist who has created the world's first gene edited babies has given rise to various questions on the ethics of gene editing across the world. Editing the DNA to correct disease mutations has been possible now, mainly due to the various technologies available, like the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool, through which the promises of gene editing are boundless. In this regard, several clinical trials are currently being carried out to treat the diseases like HIV, multiple myeloma, and other forms of cancer using the CRISPR-Cas9 editing system, but none of them involve editing the so-called human germline, that is, cells at the embryonic stage, and they have restricted themselves to correct the genetic defects in sick adults. In the experiment carried out by the Chinese scientist, he has deactivated a gene in the two embryos, thereby seeking to immunize a pair of twins from HIV. This could have unintended consequences, like various studies have shown that gene editing could result in unintended mutations which can turn into cancers, and also there is a danger of mosaicism in which some cells will inherit the target mutation while others don't. These changes could be inherited by the next generation. Therefore, it is too early for germline editing as the risks associated with such experiment are still unknown, and scientists world over are far from understanding how exactly individual genes influence phenotypes, which is the visible traits of people. This is because every gene influences multiple traits depending on the environment of the individual, and therefore it is hard to predict the ultimate outcome of an embryo editing exercise without decades of follow-up. In this specific case, while the scientist has edited a gene called CCR5 in order to immunize a pair of twins from HIV, a deactivated CCR5 gene can also make people more susceptible to West Nile fever. Every gene influences such trade-offs, thereby requiring abundant caution when dealing with the human germline. Therefore, such an intervention would be defensible only in very rare situations where no alternative exists, and perhaps it is time to bring in regulations to prevent the ill effects of gene editing. The next issue is regarding the Rafael deal. As you are aware, there has been a controversy over the steep hike in prices of the Rafael Jets. The various India-specific enhancements in terms of the hardware and software capabilities of the aircraft resulted in a steep hike in the price and was spread over 36 jets to be brought in flyaway condition rather than the previously planned 126 aircraft. The government has said that the cost due to this India-specific enhancements are a non-recurring cost, but questions arise on why did the government fail to secure the follow-on provision which would have given India the option to purchase more jets and reduce the price per aircraft by spreading the design and development costs involved in these upgrades. In this whole episode, it is nobody's case that any information which could impact the aircraft's operational capability or negatively affect national security should be shared with the public, but the government should adopt a more accommodating posture with respect to the issue of pricing through measures like arranging private briefings for opposition leaders and permitting a joint parliamentary committee to examine the deal. Now let's move on to some of the most important international issues in news, starting with Brexit. As you are aware, Brexit means Britain exiting the European Union. Several factors were put forth before the referendum, like the immigration issue, the sovereignty issue of the Britain, and also several economic issues, which led to a mandate of 52% voting for a Brexit while 48% voting against it. Following 2 years of negotiations with the European Union, Prime Minister Theresa May had drafted a deal, but the British Parliament has voted down this deal with a humongous majority, with most of them being the members of the Conservative Party, which is led by Theresa May herself. Following this, a trust vote was moved against Prime Minister Theresa May, which she survived by a narrow margin. Given this backdrop, the British PM is left with very few options, and one of the least controversial is to extend the exit date from the European Union. From the beginning, she had argued that a hard Brexit, which means a no deal with the European Union, is better than a bad deal, but the deal which was drafted after 2 years of negotiation has been rejected by the British Parliament, thereby reflecting the complexity of the issue. Keeping the economic issues aside, there is also the issue of the Good Friday Agreement, which allowed the flow of goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which would be negatively affected if a Brexit deal were not to be concluded, which would facilitate transition and soft exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. Given all these complexities and the deep differences which persist within the Conservative Party itself, there is an increasing demand led by the Labour Party, which is calling for a second referendum to be held on the issue so that the citizens could make a more informed decision. However, majority of the MPs have resolved to respect the popular mandate given by the first referendum, but in the meanwhile, support is growing both within and outside the British Parliament to prevent Britain from crashing out of the EU, and in this regard, the British PM has to take in the British Parliament into confidence before any further moves. The next issue is the political crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela has been in an economic and political crisis since the oil prices started falling from the year 2014, as it was over reliant on petroleum export and was borrowing heavily to fund its overspending on social welfare programs. The country has plunged into a deeper crisis when the head of the National Assembly declared himself as the acting president, thereby challenging the authority of the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. This was recognized by the US, Canada, Brazil, and a host of other Latin American countries, which led to the Venezuelan president cutting off diplomatic ties with the US and ordering the American diplomats to leave within 72 hours. This is worrisome because at least 90% of the people in Venezuela are now below the poverty line, with an inflation forecast to touch 10 million% this year, with severe food and medicine shortages. The economic crisis has triggered a massive migrant crisis with nearly 3 million people fleeing the country. In this background, The efforts from the opposition party to overthrow the current government has been suppressed using brute force, and also the main opposition party had boycotted the last year's presidential election, claiming that the election was not free and fair. In this regard, President Maduro shares a lot of blame for the mismanagement of the economy, but forcibly removing him from power may destabilize the country further. Therefore, it requires a coordinated international effort to restore some degree of economic and political normalcy in the country, and in the long run, it is up to the people of Venezuela to decide on their political fortunes. The final issue we'll discuss today is regarding the developments in the Chinese economy and its impact on global trade. China, which is the world's second largest economy, has reported a fall in its exports, and the Chinese government has made a drop in its growth target from 6.5% last year to 6% in the current year. Further, China's trade surplus with the US has increased, which is likely to put added pressure on the Chinese exports to the US. China's factory activity has also contracted to a 2-year low, which is also reflected in the drop in the demand for cars, thereby pointing to the fall in demand from Chinese consumers. Also, leading players like Apple, Jaguar Land Rover, and other companies have warned of weak earnings due to the slowdown in their sales in China, which has great implications for the global growth. What is to be noted here is China has been struggling to transit from its earlier growth model, which was led by cheap exports and huge capital investments, into a more domestic consumption led economy. And in the recent times, the Chinese central bank had tried to control the cheap debt, which had fueled its impressive growth run. A point to be noted here is even though China wants to move towards consumption led growth, the state has been wary of allowing economic sectors like real estate, which were earlier boosted by the availability of cheap credit, to be driven by market forces. In this regard, a true restructuring of its export and state led economic model will not be possible until China allows the liquidation of uneconomical projects and thereby move towards a market driven economy. China's capacity to manage its economic transition therefore has implication to the global economy, and it remains to be seen what steps China takes in achieving its goal. On that note, I'm wrapping up this roundup session. However, there were other very important issues like the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, Syria, which I've already discussed in detail, and I request those who missed it to please go back and watch the same. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.